is from Bob Vinicum.
A question for the panel. Now that Iraq has descended into civil war, does all the panel agree that the toppling of the Saddam Hussein regime, under which all the factions of Islam and the Christians lived together in a relative harmony, which was toppling engineered by Tony Blair and George Bush and the neocons, do you all agree that was a war crime of monumental proportions?
Josh.
Well, I don't think you can say that the people of Iraq under Saddam Hussein lived in harmony. And if you wind the clock back to 2003, when the decision was taken to go to war, it was in the shadow of 9/11, and for Australians, it was after we lost more than 80 Australians in the Bali bombing in 2002. And the greatest threat to the world at that time was seen as nuclear terrorism. Now, Saddam Hussein had used chemical weapons against the Kurds in the north and against the Shiites in the south. He was obstructing the weapons inspectors. He was paying $25,000 to every family of a Palestinian suicide bomber.
Quick question, were there any chemical weapons in the end?
Well, they were never found. They were never found, but as inquiry after inquiry found, the only government at that time who didn't think he had had chemical or biological weapons was actually the government of Iraq. Every country, even the ones who opposed the war, the French, the Germans, Kevin Rudd said it was a matter of empirical fact. Now, the question is, did we make mistakes after we went into Iraq? Absolutely. The de-Baathification of that country, when that was the major institution, taking down the army and allowing all these military-trained people to go out into the community and basically be conscripted by terrorist organisations, they were big mistakes. And now we have a really big problem, because you're right, there's a fragmentation of Iraq between Shiites and Sunnis. I think one person who is going to come under the microscope now is the Prime Minister of Iraq, Nouri al-Maliki, because he really has governed for the Shiite majority, not for the Sunni minority. He's purged the military and the parliament of his opponents, and he's helped bring this thing on. And now it's a global problem. It is an Australian problem, because our security... Of
course, it was the Americans who gave him a leg up into power originally.
Yeah.
So, once again, a series of mistakes when you manipulate who's going to be in government.
And hindsight's a beautiful thing, but absolutely. There were lots of mistakes that were made. In fact, the Americans wanted to keep more troops there, but Maliki, under pressure from the Iranians and others, said no. So I'm looking at the current situation and I am very worried. Right. I'm worried, one, about the humanitarian disaster, 500,000 people fleeing from Mosul on our TV screens, the brutal killings, the mass rapes. This is a real problem. The second thing is, if Iraq stays fragmented, and Mosul and Tikrit and those other places do not come back to the government per se, Iraq will turn out like Afghanistan, and then it becomes the HQ for world terrorism, and we know that hurts Australia. Right. So that's a big problem.
Right. Yeah, but the question isn't just, there's not, with respect, just one question of did we make mistakes when we went in. The other question is, should we have gone in? And
the question that was asked, I'll just bring you right back to the question that was asked. Was it a monumental war crime? That's what the questioner asked.
Look, I mean, in terms of that, there's a whole legal definition about what constitutes a war crime. But from my perspective and from a lot of people's perspective, the basis for going into Iraq changed. It went from weapons of mass destruction to links with Al-Qaeda, which then didn't eventuate. And we went in there, and then it leads to your second question of once we did go in as the part of the sort of coalition of the willing, as it was described, what happened as a result of that? Now, certainly, and I know there'll be differences of opinion on this, there was definitely a need for us to attend to Afghanistan. And we've previously discussed this. But the whole issue of Iraq now is that we upended that country, and now we're confronted with very serious events there, which may compel us potentially, you don't know what the engagement will be from this point onwards. But when Josh made reference to the fact of the humanitarian concerns, we've also had humanitarian concerns in another part, in another country, in Syria, where people are worried about what's happened in Syria and the impact that it's had on Lebanon as well. I mean, and these have been tough areas, and the problem's been, the world hasn't been able to respond effectively on Syria, And now we're also being potentially pressed as to what do we do in Iraq. And this doesn't downplay the seriousness of it, very serious. But when we went into Iraq, a lot of people were seriously worried about what long-term ramification would unfurl as a result of this. And I hate to think that we're seeing the consequences of this now.
James.
Look, Bob, Saddam Hussein was a monster. He was worse than Gaddafi in Libya. He was far worse. He killed far, far more people than the Serbs did in Bosnia. He was a monster. Now, we live in a hard world. You're making tough choices. I don't know if it was the right choice, but it was a tough, they haven't gone into Syria. Maybe they should have. I think they shouldn't personally, but it's a hard call. It's a hard call to know what to do about Saddam Hussein. And to use ridiculous phrases like monumental war crime, it was a very tough call. Personally, I wouldn't have gone into Iraq. I would have possibly gone into Saudi Arabia myself after 9/11, but it was a very tough call. You can't use hindsight.
You're the law professor. Was it a legal call?
Well, they had it's international law is fairly amorphous and vague, and he had an opinion. You can get an opinion from any barrister you want on almost anything. So it's a very difficult call.
Are you saying, in fact, it might have been illegal?
Well, look, if you want to use international law to bomb somebody, technically, you might need approval of Security Council. You know what that means, Bob? That means that China has a veto and Russia has a veto, and you never get anything. You can't even get approval to go into Syria because the Chinese will block it. Now, some people might think that at the end of the day, the best guardian for world affairs is the UN. Personally, I would prefer the Americans. At the end of the day, it's a hard world. They're going to make better calls than China and Russia.
The Americans didn't make it the great call. They went into a country
that had... They made a great call on Serbia. Hang on, they made a great call on Serbia.
I'm just going to interrupt you because you didn't want to be interrupted yourself.
The Americans went into Iraq. They circumvented United Nations. They went into a country that had very few jihadists and that had a secular, although pretty terrible man, but at least the country was functioning. You cannot say they left it better than when they went in.
Well, I'm not doubting that it was a secular. Dictators tend to keep order. They keep order in Egypt. They keep order in Iraq.
The country was functioning.
If that's your test, then you shouldn't go into any dictator. We just leave dictators alone. Now, it's a hard call, right?
Let's ask Virisila. You actually, I suppose you have had a dictator in your country, so you probably have some idea about that subject. But leaving Fiji out of it, what do you think about what happened in Iraq?
Well, personally, I really don't think they should be going into Iraq. I think we should learn from hindsight. I think that the first time they went in, there was no weapons of mass destruction. And I don't think, if there is a problem there, let the Iraqis sort it out themselves. If they want an intervention, maybe they should use diplomacy. Let's start off with diplomacy first. I think that's extremely important. And I think that Australia, as a leader in the Pacific, I think they need to take, I think this is a bad move on their part. This is showing that if they're going to intervene in Australia using military intervention. Interestingly, we have a dictatorship in our home. Not that I'm saying that I wanted a military intervention, but where do you draw the line? Like in some countries you'll have military intervention, and in some countries you won't. You have same dictatorship problems there. I mean, the intensity of it is probably not as big as Iraq. But
would it have been different, do you think, if there was oil in Fiji?
That's my point. I think that's the only reason why they go into Iraq is because there is oil.
There's no oil
and
in Yugoslavia.
None,
and I'm betting that Ed's pretty glad the Americans bombed the Serbs. I'm just going out on a limb here. Maybe Ed will correct me on that.
Well, I wouldn't put it... Come on, Jim, I wouldn't put it that way. But certainly there were horrific crimes being enacted. And the Americans did take a leadership role in trying to say, look, we can't have this continue. And they also took a leadership role, particularly through Richard Holbrooke, in negotiating the Dayton Accord and bringing peace to a place that had been troubled. But,
OK, that's a sidebar argument. I'm just going to bring Josh back in with a very simple question. Did Tony Abbott jump the gun by refusing to rule out sending Australian troops back into Iraq?
Well, he hasn't jumped the gun because there's no offer or request on the table.
But isn't that something one would automatically rule out, or is it still on the table to do it?
The Americans have ruled out sending in troops.
Since then they have.
Well, they've ruled out sending troops. But I think what Tony Abbott...
But what if the Americans had said, actually, it'd be quite good if you sent troops and we'll all be in the same foxhole again?
Well, I think we all feel that, and not just at this table, but probably across the country, that we have made done our bit in Iraq, and there probably wasn't the stomach to send in troops again. But I think if you think that diplomacy will deal with ISIS, you're very misguided, unfortunately, because this is a group who is carrying out butchery on a major scale, and they want to set up a caliphate that takes in, Jordan, the West Bank, Syria, Iraq, and you've now got Iran who is buying into this because Iran is a Shiite country. And once Iran buys in, then what does Saudi Arabia and Turkey, which are Sunni countries, indeed Egypt with its own problems as Sunni countries. So there is a much bigger issue here.
Sorry, Josh, ISIS is Sunni. Are you saying that Iran is buying into ISIS?
On the other side of the equation.
What I'm saying is, Ali Sistani and Muqtada al-Sadr and other Shiite figures, indeed, Nouri al-Maliki is a Shiite leader in Iraq, and they are calling for Iranian help, and Iran has sent in revolutionary guards. Now, this is a real problem, and just for people watching this, it does affect Australia, because we have had Australians go and volunteer in Syria. It's an issue which is of great security concern to the Australian government. If Iraq fragments, then this is a broader field for these people to go into. And then, as a country, we become less safe and our interests become less safe.
Okay, just to go back to the original question, though, should Australia take any responsibility at all, along with the United States, for the fragmentation of Iraq that you just talked about, for the consequences of that war?
Well, I think you have to look at what has happened. You've had Nouri al-Maliki, who hasn't done anyone a service.
No, that was a simple question, though.
But because what I'm saying is it's not what actually transpired immediately after the invasion and the occupation. The fragmentation of Syria has helped bring about this in Iraq, because there's been the flow of fighters from Syria into Iraq, there's been the bad governance in Iraq. These are the major factors which has created the current situation.
We must move on.